Hello everyone and welcome to the virtual campus.
The scholars, the alumni, the fellows, it's such an amazing tribe to be part of.
I think marketing in many quarters is brilliantly practiced, in many other quarters is uselessly practiced. The point is we can learn from the good and also from the bad.
Every single client always has the first question. We want to have a very difficult conversation around race, but we don't know where to start.
Marketability, saleability is an intrinsic part of creating product value.
But the thing is that you want to learn, you will remember it far more if you learn that thing with the intention of sharing it with somebody else.
Athletes would think we're insane. An athlete would never expect to not look after their body yet turn up and win a race. And we are no different, because this thing here is the thing that has to turn up every day.
Welcome to everybody on the virtual campus, all of our scholars, our alum, our fellows, our partners, everybody, and all of those who have got the golden ticket. Welcome and congratulations. And so we're here today with Penny, who I'm going to introduce you to big time in a minute. But just before I do, a couple of shout outs. One interesting thing, we've decided to create a LinkedIn group for everybody on the virtual campus. So the reason why we're doing this is because we figured that that'll be a much easier way for us to communicate all of the new lives and on demands with you all without spamming your inboxes constantly. So you have to click the link to join it, and the link is on the hub. So you're going to have to, after this, jump over to the hub, click the link, join the LinkedIn group so that we can share loads of information with you, and then you can also talk to each other. So we figured that that might be a really good value add around the virtual campus. So make sure that you do that. We've got a lot of new sessions on demand and coming up live, but I'm going to tell you about them at the end of the session today. So just make sure that you stay tuned. So I'm really pleased to see where you're all dialing in from. And I'm hoping that we're going to have a few of the current scholars in the UK and Australia. I know that there were a number of scholars that met Penny earlier on this year. But in Australia, you don't get to meet Penny quite so often because she's cracking on a bit. And we just don't want her doing that 24-hour flight all the time. So much as she hates it, because she wants to be in Australia every year, I delivered the Living Leader element for the scholars this year, Pen, and I was channeling you the whole time. So just know that. I was channeling you. Because for those of you in the room that aren't on any of our main programs, I will just give you context that Penny is the founder of the Living Leader, which is, as the title may suggest, a leadership development program. And 2 days of the 3-day Living Leadership program are embedded in the first boot camp of every scholarship in every territory. So in the UK, in Australia, and in the US. So in the order of 800 of our scholars have experienced this 2-day leadership program. And Penny has, over the last 13 years, donated around £1.5 million worth of development program to the Marketing Academy so the scholars can experience it. And one of the reasons why she's done that is, well, firstly, I asked her to, but Penny and I have known each other for a long time. So we're figuring it's around 22, 23 years. And in fact, Penny was probably close to the age I am now when we first met. And because Pen, I remembered I came to your 60th birthday, which was a couple of years after we met. So we were introduced by a mutual friend. We got an email, a joint email, and he just said, look, I don't know what will happen, but I believe that the two of you need to get together because I think something will. So we met up at this awful place on like a motorway service station in the middle of nowhere. And we didn't know who each other were. And I don't even think we had LinkedIn then. No, we couldn't have done. And so Penny phoned my office in the morning, about an hour and a half before we were due to meet. She got through to me, and this extremely posh voice, which you'll hear in a minute. So she could well have said, "Hello, it's Lady Penelope here." She said, "Hello, it's Penny Ferguson." And she said, we're due to meet in an hour and a half. And I said, "Yes, that's right." And she said, "Well, I have a question for you." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "Who the fuck are you?" And I thought, oh, I'm going to love this woman. I am going to love this woman. So I said, "Well, I was thinking the same thing about you. So why don't we keep it to ourselves and talk about it when we meet?" That's what we did. And that meeting, I've got to say, was the start of what will be a lifelong relationship for both of us. So I went on Penny's leadership program a few years after we met. Took her a while to get me to go on it because I thought I was brilliant. If anybody knows my journey, you know that I used to think I was brilliant until I realised I was shit. And then Penny actually put my entire team through the program, and they went before me, and then they all came back afterwards, and they were all, "You really should go on this program, Sherilyn. You really should go on." And I thought, shit, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. And I went on the program and realised I wasn't. So Penny is our leadership guru, and we're sharing her with you for the next hour. And we're going to do another session this afternoon. So if you're in the UK, I think it's 3 p.m. this afternoon. We're going to do another session for our cohorts in the US. So Pen, big warm welcome to the virtual campus. And I thought we'd just start by, I'm going to ask you to just talk us through your journey, your leadership journey. We do talk about your journey on the Living Leader program, but of course, not everybody can access that directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So not calling you a horse, but I think if you just talk us a little bit about your journey, that'd be really special.
Yeah. Good morning, lovely. Great to see you. I hope you're feeling better. We're both somewhat in the wars, everybody. I tripped over, protected my head, but fractured my wrist in protecting my head when I landed on concrete. So I think I'm quite glad that it's my arm, not my head, but there we go. So my journey really started, and I started very late in life. It didn't start until I was 50. And at the age of 50, my life was not in a good space. In fact, it was really pretty shitty. My third marriage had just come to an end. And my third marriage had been the worst of all of them. I'd lost all the money I ever had, and I was the one who came to all the marriages with money. Dad had left me a lot of money at the age of 18. Probably in this day and age would be equivalent to about 4.5 million quid. But in 3 marriages, I'd managed to lose a lot, investing in husband's businesses, doing all sorts of things, and I suppose doing as I was told, really. So I now had no money at all. I was in debt. I'd lost all my confidence. And worst of all, my second son, who'd gone become schizophrenic at the age of 18 and been really bad in and out of mental hospitals, jumped out of 3rd floor windows twice and died at the age of 26. So my life was in a really bad space. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I'd got no confidence. And it was a journey that for a year, I sort of did all sorts of weird and wonderful things, trying to find out what I wanted to do, because I knew at some level I just wanted to make a difference to other people's lives in some way, shape or form. And on top of that, I realized I was a really bad example to my remaining 5 children. And so everything was in sort of trauma, really. So I qualified in massage, sports massage, aromatherapy, reflexology, became a Reiki healer, Orasoma colour healing, and qualified as a hypnotherapist. So I had an incredibly busy year trying to find out what I wanted to do. Interestingly, I began to find out more about what I didn't want, which helped me find the journey of what I did want. And one of the things that had really bugged me in my last marriage was he was an amazing management and leadership trainer. I probably put him on a pedestal because people always used to leave the programs saying, "Oh, best program I've ever done, fantastic." But what I couldn't get my head around was I would go and meet the clients probably 3 months, 5 months later. And I'd ask lots of questions about how it had gone, what's changed and everything. And the more I dug down, I thought, yeah, but this actually isn't having an impact at all, because all they can say is people thought it was a great program. But when I really started to dig down and say, but what behavior change have you seen as a result? There was virtually nothing. And they seem to have forgotten at best 80% of it within 6 weeks. So that for me didn't fit with my values. I was really uncomfortable. I thought, well, here are people spending a lot of money thinking that they're going to get real value from it. And the actual value is almost nothing, because in really simple terms, if you acquire lots of wonderful knowledge and do nothing different with it, the reality is that you've just wasted your money. What's the point of having knowledge that you keep inside you and don't do something different as a result? So this had really bugged me. And as well as going on this journey of all these amazing training, I also did a lot of programs, some of them ranging from your big names, you'll all have heard of them, Tony Robbins, Landmark Education, and lots of spiritual ones. And I remember the spiritual ones occasionally tipping up and thinking, oh my God, who can I phone to say there's a crisis at home and get me out immediately? But anyway, I did all this. It was a real journey. But I used to ask a lot of business people on these big programs, how do you use what you're learning here back in the workplace? And I reckon 99% of them said you couldn't take this to the workplace. If you took this sort of personal development to the workplace, people would think that you were funny in the head. You know, it's sort of this hug a tree type program. And I thought, I wonder if this is why so much training doesn't stick. Is it that people see themselves as two different people? And of course, that means you've always got to remember, as you're going into the workplace, to pick up the skills toolkit. And maybe you don't always remember. But I thought, why is it people say it themselves as two different people? Could I bring these two halves together in a way that is acceptable in the workplace? People don't go, oh my God, it's this airy fairy stuff. So I don't know how the heck I came up with it. I still say somebody up there gave me this program, you know, as if they were saying, this is what you're here for in this lifetime. Now get out there and do it and work it out as you go along. But I put this program together and I managed to persuade 6 people to come and pilot it, which was a challenge because, of course, they didn't know who the heck I was. And it was the oddest little group, ranging from a managing director through to a housewife going through a crisis. And I was so nervous. And I ran it from where I lived at the time, trying to keep 9 long-haired Jack Russells quiet in the kitchen at the same time. And I did the first 2 days because the program, as Sherilyn said, is 3 days. It's 2 days gap of 3 weeks and a 1-day follow-up. And I did this first 2 days, and somebody whose name I will never, ever forget, called Annabelle Parahia, who was head of all development training for Sun Microsystems in the UK. And she said, Penny, that 2 days has just changed my life. And I went, oh, I got the faintest idea why. And she said, I want more people from Sun to come through it and see what they think. And I found that I've got a big client, Sun Microsystems, and I was running programs. And my goodness, that was a wake-up call, because what I then realized was that actually, my last husband had not been teaching leadership. He'd been teaching management. Secondly, I realized that actually I hadn't understood leadership at all. And the more I ran the program, the more I began to understand what leadership truly was all about. And it took me a year probably to begin to understand a couple of things that I suppose really shook me. And that was that actually leadership is incredibly simple. Incredibly simple. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's really simple. And the other thing that became very clear to me is this isn't a set of skills that you pick up the toolbox. It's the absolute foundation of life. Leadership is about every single moment of every day. From the minute you get up in the morning to the minute you go to bed at night. It's the foundation of absolutely every part of life. So why isn't everybody doing it if it's simple? And it's really interesting. And I think what comes more naturally to us, and it took me a long time to recognize this, is management. Now, we define those in really simple ways. And the way we describe them is outstanding managers drive people to perform at the highest level they're capable of. It's very much about control. Outstanding leaders inspire them to do it for themselves, and it's more about freedom. Both of them, don't ever hear me say management is bad, because it isn't, but it has its place, and it's not something that you want to do all the time. And the thing that shocked me rigid and made me wish I'd really learned this before the age of 50 was in bringing up my 6 children, I'd managed them. And in managing them, and quite often as a manager, it's interesting because you really care about people. Obviously, I adore my children, but even as a manager at work, you really, really care about people and you want to do the best for them. And that means that every time they do something that's not helpful, you want to point it out to them and tell them a way that they might do it that's going to be more effective. You know, with my children all the time, they'd be, if I'd see them about, and I've made so many cock-ups in my life, let's be honest, I was number 1 at cock-ups. And if they did something that I thought wasn't helpful, I'd tell them very quickly and suggest a better way that they might be able to do it. So I was always giving them advice. I was always loving them and wanting to help them in the best way I could. And the reality was I was absolutely educating them how not to think for themselves. I was educating them that they couldn't do anything without me. And the reality was they could never be better than I was yesterday, because it all came out of my head. And so for me, learning the importance of how leadership is so key rather than management, more so than management, let me put it like that, more so than management, was just so critical. Now, that program, as I say, it took me a year to really begin to understand it. But that program's changed my life through teaching it, delivering it. But we've now had over 80,000 people go through the program, and it's been translated into 5 languages. So I think it's probably been pretty effective. And all it is simple. And so my journey began literally and Sherilyn, you met me pretty soon after I'd started, you know, because if you remember, I was up in Leicester at the time. Yeah. And I moved down to Newbury as a result of meeting you.
I think you just had you just converted the area that you were going to deliver that you were delivering the programs in. The physical building that you were delivering the programs in. Yeah, and look, I remember it well. And I remember how long it took you to get me to go on it, because it's the thing. I mean, I must have been then. What would I have been? I would have been in my early 40s, wouldn't I? No, late 30s. No. Yeah, late 30s. Late 30s, mid 30s. I was running what was quite a successful executive search headhunting company and leading a team of people. And I honestly thought I knew it all. You know, in my head, I was like, you can't teach me anything I don't know. I've been doing this for years. Look how successful my business is. But in absolute truth, it wasn't. It really wasn't, in that it was only successful because I was putting in 17 hours a day, stressed and anxious all of the time, telling my team what to do. So it was successful in that I knew what to do, and I was telling everybody to do the same thing, but there was no growth in it at all. And I certainly wasn't developing any of my people. It was a revolving door. I used to actually think, do you know what? I just hire people that want to come and work for 2 years and then go somewhere else. It was a revolving door. So there was no sustaining of business growth in there. And I nearly killed myself. And I remember saying to, you know, you phoning me a lot around that time and going, how are you feeling? And every time we talk, I go, oh, I'm really stressed. Do you remember? I used to say it all the time, oh, really stressed, I'm really stressed, I'm really stressed. And then going on the program really changed the way in which, I saw everything. And for me, one of the big aha moments was really understanding that difference between management and leadership, because I feel like I'd only ever told people what to do for whatever reason, probably selfish, also because clearly I wanted to ensure in my world that they were doing the right thing for them and that this stuff would make them successful, wouldn't it? And that's how I continued to drive the business until I went through the program. So let's talk about leadership in a little bit more depth then. So you say it's simple. Give us what you believe are a few of the simplest lessons, the simplest tools in the kit that everyone in the room, you know, regardless of whether they've experienced the program or can go through the program, everybody in the room can learn from.
Okay, well, as you know, for me, leadership comes down to three really simple things. How you choose to think, understanding responsibility at a profoundly different level, and communication, our own communication and the impact it has. And those three things link together. You can't separate them. So how you choose to think, one of the things, again, that I found really interesting, beginning to recognize that a lot of the time what we are inclined to do is always look for things. There's lots of different ways we can look at how we think, but I'm just going to focus on one at the moment. And that is what we're apt to look for when we have a team. We look where something is not going as well as it should, so we can help that person put it right. So we get people focusing on what's not going well. So we're putting their attention on behaviors that we don't want. Now, I believe that anybody who is not performing as well as they could, they might try and bag it or try and hide it or disguise it or make it look better in the workplace. When they wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, they know. So they then come into work and the boss is telling them other areas they're not doing well and madly giving them advice how to do it better. So all the attention, I believe, is in the wrong place. And somehow what you need to do is change the thinking so that they begin to look for what's going well. So all the time, what you need to be thinking about is, can I get people's attention focused on behaviors that we want? Now, a lot of times I see in organizations, and I find it really quite sad, people will only comment when somebody's doing something well if it's exceptional, rather than noticing the little things all the time. So, for example, you might go walking past somebody, one of your team, and they're on the phone, and you want to talk to them, but you wait, and you hear them on the phone, and you hear the way they're talking to the supplier, the client, whoever it is on the other end, and you hear in the voice the caring, the attention they're giving that individual. You can almost hear the smile in the voice. What a great idea when they come off the phone to say, I could really hear how well you were building a relationship with that individual. It sounded so positive that building that relationship is going to unquestionably bring you in more business or get you whatever it is. And that person feels good. When you feel good, how much more likely are you now to handle the next call even better? But a lot of the time we don't bother to comment on those things. So what we do all the time is we put our attention and our thinking on what's going badly and how can make it better. You said earlier how you were stressed all the time. How useful was it that you had all your thinking on how stressed you were all the time? Rather than saying, okay, let me look for the areas that's going well at the moment. Let me tell the people in my team how well they're doing in these particular areas. If people feel good, guess what? They perform better. So how we choose to think is really key. The other thing around responsibility, this is a really interesting one, and I gave the example of my children. I was teaching them how not to take responsibility because I was always giving them advice. And getting people to take responsibility or take ownership is really key. And again, it sounds crazy, but it's really simple. So let's say in an organization that you've got, doesn't matter if it's a strategy, doesn't matter if it's a vision, doesn't matter if it's purpose. And at the most senior levels, what you're doing is you're endeavoring to inspire them to go along with the purpose, with the vision, with the strategy. Because you may get thoughts from further down, but it all comes from most senior levels. And you want people to go with you, to believe in the purpose, the vision, the strategy. But how often do they really own it, take responsibility so they feel they own it? Because what you're doing is you're communicating with them in a way that is powerful, you hope, inspirational, you hope, to get the message across. But do they own it? So the only way now that you can get them to take responsibility is by asking questions in a way that gets them to begin to think about it for themselves. So, for example, if you knew you could help that vision come alive for you and your team, how might you approach it? If you really knew that the purpose of the organization is about doing X, Y, Z, how do you think you might take ownership of that purpose? If you knew that the strategy is key, and there's bits of it that you can really own and deliver, how might you choose to go about that? So what you're doing is asking them questions to think about it for themselves. Now, we call those empowering questions or incisive questions. I believe that if you can learn to ask questions that start the sentence with, if you knew that, it's really powerful. Because what you're doing is asking the question in a way that's putting an assumption in the beginning that they've already got the answer. So that means that they begin to look for it in the brain. So asking questions to get people to think about it and own it is how you get people to take responsibility. And I'll give you, this is nothing to do with work, but it's an example I often give because this just shows how different the impact can be. And this is talking about my younger daughter, Emma, who, as some people know, is also my co-director. Now, when Grace, her daughter, was quite young, probably about 10, Grace came back from school one day and said, "Mummy, I don't want to do my homework today." Sorry about that, guys. I'm home. I hope somebody will answer it. So coming back, she said, "I don't want to do my homework." Now, I don't know about any of you. I know what Sherilyn, you and I would have done before we learned this. So I'd have said, "Now listen, darling, let me explain to you why it's so important you do your homework. You really need to do your homework because that's going to help you get on in life." And you'd come up with a whole load of reasons. At the end of it, you'd have just said, "Bloody sit down and do it." Right? And Emma didn't. Ems went, "That's okay, darling, that's fine," and just left it. And then about an hour and a half before bedtime, she says to Grace, "Darling, just tell me, I'm really curious. What are you going to tell your teachers tomorrow when you turn up with no homework?" And Grace went, "Oh, Mummy, can I have an extra half hour so that I can go and do my homework?" "Yes, darling, of course you can." So what she did, instead of trying to persuade her a way to do things, which is management, what she did was straightforward leadership and give her responsibility by asking her the question to think about what might the consequences be. Now, when I look back, I know without any shadow of doubt, I managed my children all the time. So that gives an indication about responsibility, about ownership. So if with your team, with your organization, with anything, thinking about how can I get them to own it rather than me trying to persuade them to own it. And that goes straight into the third thing that I said is key about leadership, which is communication. If you keep giving your opinions all the time, or you keep giving advice, you're communicating from the I. Let me tell you what I think. Let me tell you what my suggestion is, because I've got a great idea. Let me tell you why I don't agree with that. And so you're all the time coming from the I. In my experience, most of the time it's because you care. You really care about people getting better results. Every time you do that, what you're doing is sending the message, you can't do that without me. I'm educating you how not to think for yourself, and you can never be better than I was yesterday because it's only going to come from my thoughts and ideas. So when you really want to get people to take ownership, you need to communicate from the you. What do you think about that? Let me make sure that I bring you into the conversation. Let me make certain that I'm really listening to you. So you have to develop your ability to listen. You have to really find out the way of asking questions. And when they come up with some ideas, you think, you've got a choice. Do you go straight in with disagreeing, or you come back with another question? Hey, that's really interesting, but actually I can identify some risks here. What do you think those risks might be? Everything that you're doing is seeing if you can help them think more and more effectively. So that just gives you a little insight into how you choose to think, responsibility and communication, and the three things link together. So for me, and we use on the program all sorts of different vehicles to help people begin to look at those things. We use all sorts of models. And I always say it's not the models that are important, it's the messages behind them. So is that giving enough quickly?
It is. I mean, it should be a 6-hour session so that they can get the whole lot. But that's great. So what do you feel might be the biggest challenges or barriers for anyone in the room that isn't in the number one position, right? That isn't in the top hierarchy? Because, as you know, I am firmly of the belief that the leadership crisis in the world is pretty much predicated on the fact that there are still baby boomers leading companies and Gen X's leading companies. And until we retire, drop dead or retire, the new generation are just not, they're role modeling unhealthy, hierarchical leadership styles that were created pre-war, right? The behaviors and beliefs were created decades and decades ago. And so we find it's quite challenging for our scholars who are in their 30s, early 30s to early 40s, because there's an assumption that the people, higher up than them, are the ones that are showing the really unhelpful behaviors or are predominantly managing and not leading. So how is just somebody within the layers within an organization, an individual, how can they shift the things that they're choosing, and how can they influence change or a ripple effect, in your opinion?
I think it comes down to what I've already said, which I make it sound really easy, but it is becoming incredibly skilled at asking questions, really, really skilled. And it's the one thing, it doesn't matter who goes through the program at what level, it's the one thing I will come back to again and again. And I had a wonderful example when I was working with a client recently over in America. And there was somebody who is very senior in the top team and said how and it's the top team of a big division, okay? And something had been sent out from head office in the UK, legal, and it had gone out and it was a very strong email, but nobody in the top team in this division had been told about it. And it caused an absolute rumpus. And so she went in to see the person in legal and was rightly very cross. And of course, all you got was two people at each other like this. And I said, how useful was that to be able to approach it in that way? She said, well, no, it wasn't. And they didn't like it. Think about it. The minute you're criticized, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you know you're wrong. You almost instinctively feel defensive. None of us like being criticized. And I said, how much more useful would it have been if you could have gone with a question along the lines of, if you knew that email you sent out has actually caused quite a lot of problem in our division, how would you feel about that? If you knew that you might be able to do it differently another time, how do you think you could approach it? So what you're doing is you're not criticizing so they don't have to feel defensive. You're asking a question in a way that makes them think about it for themselves. So if you are more junior in the organization and you know the culture above you is not like that, become skilled at questioning. The other thing I'd say is come back to what I said before. It's very easy to see things in your boss or above you that you don't like. Now, again, you've got the choices about, do you go in and do your best to say what you don't like, so you're into criticism? Or do you say, right, what I'm going to look for now, and bear in mind that the minute somebody starts to do things badly, quite a lot of the time, or not appropriately, what you'll begin to look for is more evidence that that's true. Even if it is crazy, you won't look for the little things they do that actually are quite good. You won't notice them. What you'll also be, it's careful what you look for, because you might just find it. Such a truth. So what you need to think about doing is, are the little things that I can see they're doing that actually are quite good? So you might say, the way you sent that message out to everybody was really useful. Thank you. If you knew that you could do more of this another time, how might you go about it? So you're beginning to get their attention focused on behaviors that you want above you. And very few people are good at appreciating or valuing people above them and telling them. They find that as scary as criticizing them. But believe me, it'll pay you back in spades. The easy thing for me to say is live the behavior yourself, no matter what's going on around you. Okay, and that's obvious, but it's not as easy when you're in an environment or a culture that's very different. But the one thing I would say is, think of this as a picture. Think about an ocean liner. How huge is an ocean liner? How big is the rudder that turns it? It's tiny. By comparison, it's tiny. So the first thing is believing that you can make a difference and believing it's possible, and picture yourself as the rudder. If I knew that I can begin to change the behaviors of people around me, how might I go about it? Ask yourself the question. So it's really the only thing you can do. But begin to tell people above you, beside you, the little things you notice they do well, and tell them. What you're doing is ask them to build on those behaviors without saying it. But that's what will begin to happen. And I don't pretend it's easy. And at the end of the day, you have a choice. You have 100% responsibility available to you. Do you want to be sucked into the culture that you don't want? Or do you want to hold on to it? And ultimately, you'll then have a choice. Is this an organisation you're going to work in or not?
Oh, marvellous, marvellous. Now, everybody in the room, if you've got any questions, she'll answer anything. So just pop it in the Q&A. But just expanding a little bit on that positive upward appreciation. Can you talk a little bit more about actual feedback? Because that is also something that comes up quite a bit with our scholars, and we actually do longer modules in the actual feedback element of the living leader, because it becomes such an issue, and that's some of the tools that you need to both give and receive feedback in the most beneficial way. Can you just share a bit of insight into that, especially the assumption is it's hard to deliver feedback up?
Are you talking about feedback, ad hoc feedback, or are you talking about feedback when you're doing a mini or even a yearly appraisal?
No, well, both. Both. We both know how we feel about appraisals if they're technology driven. Both, and maybe the expectation of balance between the two.
Okay, well, let me talk actually then about the appraisal one first, because I think this gives you a bit of an insight into the ad hoc ones as well. And I'll share with you, this is something that happened. There's somebody, I was traveling over to America. This is going back about 5 or 6 years. I was traveling over to America to spend a couple of days working with the top team. And I sat next to somebody who was very senior in BP, and we got chatting and we talked quite a lot of the journey, interesting. And he was kind of interested in what I do. And when I was out there, I suddenly got a message from him saying, have you got any time where you could meet with me? And I said, well, the only way I can do it is I've got a couple of hours at lunchtime. If you can come to the hotel where I'm working with the client. So he came over. And we spent some time together. And then I said, so what are you doing today that you were able to find the time? He said, well, I'm doing appraisals today. And he said, what I've done is I've rented a room at the hotel so that I've been able to bring it here so that I can do it. So I said, oh, that's really great. And I said, tell me, how do you approach your appraisals? I'm really curious. He said, well, to me, they're really important. I spend a lot of time preparing, thinking about for each individual. And he said, when we start the appraisal, I always share with them first what I think they've been doing really well before I go on to saying the areas where I think they need to improve. So I said, I think it's great that you spend a lot of time thinking about it, but I'm really curious. Why do you start off by telling them what they've been doing well? And he said, well, I think it's important to help them feel good to start with. And I said, no, please hear my question. Why do you tell them? And he said, well, I want them to know that I've shown interest. I said, so hang on, is this appraisal about you or about them? And I then said, how might it be if you ask them and say, tell me the areas that you think have been really good for you over this year, that you've done really well and you feel good about? And I said, they'll do that. And I said, not many people really like blowing their own trumpet too much. So if you've done your work, you'll be able to add to it and say, well, that's interesting. There's actually a couple of other things that I noticed I thought were really great as well. I said, then what about asking them and say, okay, so where are the areas that you think didn't go as well, or you really feel that you need to put some work in to improve? And I said, again, in my experience, people are apt to run themselves down more than they need to. So you're perfectly able with the work you've done to say, well, actually, I didn't think that was as bad as you're saying it was. I think maybe some whatever. So they're very aware that you've done the work on it. And then you ask them, so if you knew that in these areas it's important you improve, what are your thoughts about the steps you could take to develop yourself here? So it's all about responsibility, getting them to take ownership for what they've done well. And I said, how do you think that could be more effective? He phoned me and he got me just literally before I got on the plane when I was flying back. And he said, oh my God, he said, it's the best it's ever been. He said, it was just amazing. Now just think how little and minor the tweak is, because he'd done all the work, but what he's doing is get people to take ownership. So that to me is so important, because they've taken ownership for what they've done well. They've heard the message that the boss has spent a lot of time and care thinking about it. They've taken ownership for their development going forward. Now think about, and you said about how do people give feedback. It's never easy, especially if you're giving it upwards. But I think it's really useful to always ask for permission first. So it may be an ad hoc one. So you might be saying to the person, okay, it may be really useful if we talk through project X or whatever it is you want to talk about. And how do you feel about me giving you some feedback? Now, nobody's going to say no, unless they're very peculiar. Okay, well, let's first of all have a look and see what went well here. And now let's see, tell me, what do you think? There may be some areas that didn't work as well as it could. So why do you think that may have happened? What can we learn from this? Because if you're their boss, it has to be we. If you're looking upwards, it's your choice how you do it. But beginning to say, if you knew that there are areas where we might be able to all learn from this and do something better the next time. But personally, I would always ask for permission first. Always, because otherwise you're not coming straight at somebody. Yeah. If it's humanly possible, I would invariably ask for what's gone well. And you know that we share this in the program, that even if you've got to have a meeting with your team where everybody's coming in feeling, oh my God, this is going to be a bollocking. We know we've screwed up on this project. They all come in low energy, expecting there's a bollocking. And when that happens, the quality of thinking is poor. And what you want is high quality thinking. So invariably start with saying, okay, we know we had to look at project X. Well, we've had some pretty serious challenges. However, before we get into that, let's see if we can go around the room and each would say one area where actually we think it went well. And make sure you get it written up on the board, so that people can see they've got something positive to focus on. If you start like that, people are going to start thinking, oh, well, I mean, yeah, okay, but there was a problem, but there's some good things here we can build on. And you're lifting their energy, but most importantly, what you're doing is getting them into a place where you've raised the capacity to think well. And if you've got some problems, then you don't want people on the floor thinking, oh God, it's all awful and it's dreadful. Quality of thinking is not going to be good, not going to help you for coming up with creative ideas about how you deal, whatever the problems are.
Yeah.
So for feedback, golden rule, ask for permission first. If there's anything that you can say, okay, before we get into negative feedback, if it's really disastrous, ask for permission and say, my perception may not be accurate, but are you okay if I share with you how I felt as a result of what happened here? So, if I need to give a top team who I'm working with, basically telling them they've really screwed up badly and about to go straight in with the big guns, I will invariably start by saying, I'm not saying I'm right here. I'm sharing with you my perception.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I
That's
will
really, really, really powerful. There is somebody who's there's some questions. Yasha, and there's a couple of people that have voted for this question, is talking very specifically about where you've got to give feedback to what if a lead is defensive. If you're not delivering necessarily pleasant feedback, but the lead and your assumption is the leader may be defensive. So I'll do a few more builds on what you've just said around this, because I feel that you've answered some of that. But I would also add that in addition to asking permission, in your own mind, we need to be thinking about feedback as if you are just about to give the best gift that person is ever likely to get. And when you're giving someone a present, right, you're thinking about what that person would like to see, what you're thinking about what that person's likes and dislikes are. You think very carefully before you decide what present to give, right? And then you wrap it really nicely. And then you hand it to them in a way that's full of, I don't know, feeling for them. What they do with that present is actually out of your control. And my concern about this, because I know that leaders aren't getting feedback, especially the bad ones, right? You never want to say to somebody that's 2 levels above you, you're shit. I mean, you would never ever do it, right? That's likely to mean that they're never getting feedback from anybody. So what if we knew that they didn't realize the impact that they were having? What if we knew that? Why would we choose to withhold the gift? Because we're concerned about what they might think and feel about us. Because that's usually the thing that's going on for us, where we're going, oh, I'd really ought to give him some feedback, but I don't want to because he's going to get defensive and he's not going to like it, or she's not going to be happy with this and they're not going to love it and they're going to hate me and I might get fired and it's all about me. It's suddenly all about me. And that's one of the reasons why kind of the leaders that are doing the less than brilliant job, it's likely that nobody's giving them that feedback, but you can choose to. And then you deliver the feedback with them in mind, not you, for their benefit, not yours. Even if it might not be a benefit to you. If you give them that gift, and then you can let go of the outcome, whether they do anything with it, is it only their choice, not yours. But if you choose to withhold it, that's your choice, and that isn't leadership. So I'm really passionate about that whole feedback thing, because I just don't think anybody does it brilliantly. There's no courses you can go on just for feedback, is there? Right, we've got some more questions.
Can I just say that this is one thing that is kind of interesting. As you know, I don't run programs now. I've stood back from it. But when I was running programs, occasionally I would get people coming back on the day 3, and somebody would say, oh, I don't know what to do because my boss, he came on the program and he was wonderful for a while, but he slipped backwards and some of the old behaviors are just coming back again. And I'd look at them and I'd say, so have you told them? No. And I'd say, then don't tell me, I'm not interested. That's how blunt I was, because I thought, how can I get through to them?
Yeah.
You know, and you think about it, what you then create is a lot of people underneath start saying the same thing. And they then all begin to look for when boss is not behaving right. And none of them giving feedback, and he probably doesn't even know that he slipped.
Yeah.
And it's not fair. It's not fair.
It's not fair. No, I completely get it. Okay, Teresa's got a great question, and there's quite a few people that want me to ask this. So with remote teams, it can be very hard to see what they're working on, what they're doing well, and where they're struggling with the lack of in-person time. So that's the lack of opportunity to spot them doing things brilliantly in the workplace, right? Are there any questions that you think are particularly useful to ask remote team members who might not give too much away over a Zoom call?
Okay. Again, I would ask a question and probably make them madly uncomfortable to start with. But if you start doing it occasionally, I'd ask them the question. So if you knew that you could share with me today on this Zoom call one thing that you think you've done really well this week, what might it be? Getting them to take ownership for what they're doing well, getting them to share it with you. You know, as you know, and I don't know how many people here who are on listening to us have actually done the program, the virtual program or the live one. So I don't know. But one of the things that I think is really important is all the time thinking, how can I get people to take ownership? Now, normally what we do, as you know, is an introduction. So you get to know people at a very different level. So if you've got a team or you've got a group of people working with you and you feel you don't know them as well as you could, then start doing something to get to know them better. Even on a Zoom, you can do it. So for example, okay, you might say, look, I think it'd be great if we all get to know each other a little bit better, or however you choose to phrase it, and then say on the next meeting, which is next week, I want you all to bring one thing that is very important to you in your life. You can do it on a Zoom. So somebody might tip up wearing a garden hat. Somebody might come in with a golf club. Somebody might have their dog sitting in front of the screen, and get them to talk about why it's important. Get to know them a little better. But if you can't see things that are, or you haven't got a feeling for what's going well, ask them the question. You could do it in a group, but you need to have built up trust first. Building up trust means you need to get to know each other. How are you going to trust somebody if you don't know them? And I don't just mean know them in the workplace. I mean know them. Know some of the challenges that they might be facing in their life. Begin to know why it is that they're nervous about sharing things that they feel good about. The golden rule is this. If you're going to do something like that, you as the most senior person have to go first. That's absolutely key. And you have to be prepared to be vulnerable and be open. Because if you're not, they ain't going to open up. They're going to think, oh, he or she's asking us to do this. But what are they going to say? I might be saying too much or not enough. So you need to do that. You know, I've run programs, and this has been crazy. And we only ask about, 5 questions for people to share. We say, what do you share a bit about you and who you are? 3 things you feel good about in your life. Biggest challenge or opportunity you're facing in your life right now. What do you want to get from the program? What do you want to give to it? That's the only 5 questions. And I remember running a program for Chris Weston, who's one of the best leaders I know. And we started at 8:30. We didn't finish introductions. We only 8 of them till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And here's me worried, sick about not being able to get through the program. And Chris said, that's the most valuable thing. I don't care if we don't do anything else. I've got to know them at a level of trust that is just amazing. So
it is by a mile the best tip we can possibly give you is you can only build trust upwards, sideways, and down by giving of yourself first. It's the only way you can do it. And sharing who you are rather than what you do is it's like we preach that. We even in our selection process, so anybody in the room that's gone through the scholarship and selection process, but there's an element of that selection process that's got nothing to do with the job that you do. We're not interested. Once you get, we see what you do on your CV. We're not interested. We need to understand who you are. And that's something that you can take into your whole life, let alone, just the workplace, is dropping what we call, Penny and the Academy call the mask, dropping this mask, this defense mechanism that we put up, this fake persona that we put up when we're fearful that someone might think or feel something about us that we don't want, right? When we want to control other people think and feel of us, and this mask goes up, we don't even think about it. Subconscious. It goes up and it literally conceals who we are. And at the same time, the other person or people that we're meeting are doing exactly the same thing. This is another mask goes up. And then at the same time, you're putting a mask on the person that you're meeting or you're talking to based on all of your experiences of seeing or hearing somebody who looks a bit like that, who sounds a bit like that, who's got that job title. And you're putting a mask of expectation on them, and then they're doing the same to you. So you haven't opened your mouth yet, and there's 4 layers of absolute shit between the humanity of who you are. And you can't create meaningful relationships in any context with that mask up. And if you don't lower yours first, you've got no hope in hell of anybody else lowering theirs. You can't control whether they lower theirs or not, but you can choose whether or not you do that to you. So it's another area that we're passionate about. Well, we've got 2 minutes left. Pen, there is a question about how to start learning these questions. So I think that you've done a really good overall of if it's a question that starts with if you knew that, or what if this were true, but if you knew that, or what if. Is there anywhere that you feel that they can go to get a little bit more skilled on the questioning?
Okay. To be honest, the way I would suggest doing it is get yourself a little notebook. And whenever you have a one-on-one session, a team session, doesn't matter what it is, what I suggest you do is come out, give yourself, it doesn't need more than about 5 or 6 minutes, and ask yourself a question similar to this. If I knew I could have improved that session with good questions, what questions might I have asked? So ask yourself that. Whatever thoughts come into your head, write them in your book. Have them start with if you knew that. So whatever questions come into your head, write it in your notebook. And then this is what's key. Read them out loud, because you're bringing all your senses into being. Kinesthetic, because you created the question. Visual, you're reading it. Auditory, you're hearing it. Do that every time you come out of a session. And bit by bit, you'll find those questions, because okay, it took me a long time to get really, really, really skilled at it, but I worked at it because I knew how key it was. Now I can flip them out all the time. But it takes time.
Yeah.
Once your brain flips and you've got it, you'll never lose it. So for me, that's the best. You won't always get the questions right, doesn't matter, but what you're listening for all the time, and this, I haven't got time, but you're listening for the limiting assumptions that people have.
Yeah.
Oh no, I can't do that. And if you knew you could, what's the first step you take?
We need to do a whole session. We need to do
know.
a whole session just exclusively on that. But we do have to let these lovely people go, unfortunately. Yeah. Now, as I said, Penny, we're doing another session just like this. We didn't script this. So we're doing another session this afternoon, could go in all sorts of different directions. So if you feel free to join us again, if you want a double dose of leadership today, or if you've got teams on the virtual campus, make sure that they tune in this afternoon. So it's at 3 p.m. UK time. That's about 10 o'clock East Coast. Our US scholars will probably come in. And then this session will be available on demand in the hub. Go over to the hub after this. Make sure you join the LinkedIn group. Have a check on the new live sessions. For Pride Month, we've got Bobby from Trans in the City. She will be amazing. And we've got loads and loads of on demand that are brand new and actually really being watched. A lot of them, Peterfield sessions, like going great guns. So make sure that you hop over to that hub. Make sure that we see you very soon. Penny, I love you, as you know. You've probably got another whole load of fans from this room. I will see you again this afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Please give us your feedback. And we'd love to know what other kinds of sessions you want us to include in the virtual campus programming. So make sure you take time with the feedback. And we will see you very, very soon. So lots of love, everybody. share a few things. You've talked about questioning, which is one of the biggest kind of aha moments for anybody that goes through the program, is to really understand, you know, what we call empowering or incisive questions. If you knew that this were true, what action might you take as a result of that? Just talk through a few other nuggets that you believe that people in the room could take, even though they may not have been on the program.
Okay, well, let me share something that I think is really interesting to start with. When I used to deliver programs, and I stopped recently, nearly always one of the first questions, and as you know, for the last 5-6 years, I was mainly delivering to very top teams of pretty big organizations. I'd ask people and say, are you more towards manager or you're more towards leader? And of course, they invariably say, I'm more towards leader. You then measure their communicating behaviors. They don't know you're doing it. And what becomes very clear is that they're communicating as managers. And that is a huge wake-up call. And what I like to explain to people is, you believe that by constantly sharing your thoughts and ideas that you are influencing people, but that's not the way influence works. It's not the way the brain works. And the way we describe it is, if you take a pile of sand and you pour water on a pile of sand, some soaks in and some goes on the edge, making pathways as it goes. Take another jug of water, pour it in the pile of sand. Some may go down the existing pathways. Most of it goes down the existing pathways. Take another jug of water, it will only go down the existing pathways. That's almost an exact analogy of the way the brain works. So somebody thinks something through, and pathways, the synapses open, the traces are formed in the brain, and they come to a conclusion. Somebody says, I think you've got it wrong. Think it through again. They may find a different route. The high probability is they go down the same route. Say yet again, no, I think that's wrong. You need to look at it the way I look at it. It doesn't matter how hard they try, the traces are formed in the brain. So they go down that same route. And that means that people aren't necessarily being difficult when they won't go along with you, and you're trying to influence them by sharing your thoughts and ideas. It's just the way the brain works. So the only way now that you're going to get them to a different start point in the brain is by communicating, by asking a question. So if you knew that there might be another approach, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? If you knew that there are other possibilities, share 2 or 3 that comes straight to your head, whatever. What you're doing is taking them to a different start point in the brain. So becoming skilled at questioning is key. And it appears to not be naturally the way we go. Interestingly enough, Sherilyn, and this is what you will probably understand hugely. When you were recruiting, you were incredibly skilled at questioning. Incredibly. Because you're finding out all about the person. Come out of that environment and suddenly it all goes out the bloody window. And that's because I did the same for a while. I also did recruiting, very good at it then, and then the whole lot goes out the window. And we believe we influence, and we don't. Now, yes, there are many different types of questioning. Remember that those questions we're all taught: who, why, what, where, when. Ask open-ended questions. But there's quite a high probability that even if you ask a why, when, where question, you may still be taking them down the same pathways in the brain. So for us, we find that empowering questions or incisive questions, however you choose to frame them, are really extraordinarily powerful. Now, personally, and there are lots of questions that don't start with this, but personally, I would, if you want to start getting to incisive questions, I would start with the phrase, if you knew that. So, for example, you want people to buy into the vision or the strategy. If you knew that, you could take ownership for presenting the vision with your words. How would you choose to present them? What you're doing is you're already all feeding into their mind that they've got the answer. So they go into their mind and search for it because you've already subtly given them that as an implication. When somebody says, I can't do something, the reality is it's probably not a truth. So if you knew you could, what's the first steps that you might take? I can't do my homework. If you knew that there is a way to find your way through it, what's the first things that come into your mind? So starting with if you knew that can be really, really powerful. So when people get, and incidentally, those questions are amazingly powerful if you've got somebody who's done something really stupid on a project or on something else, and they do something really stupid, and all you want to do is say to them, how can you be so bloody stupid to do something like that, or whatever. Maybe you wouldn't be quite as impolite as that, but you anyway go in to criticize why they've done it. As soon as we're criticized, we're liable to feel very defensive. None of us like being criticized. Oh yes, but the reason I did this, oh but because, oh but, there's always some reason. And what you then get is, because people are defensive, they're unlikely to think of a useful way to respond or think of what they could do differently the next time. So instead of that, you might go in and say, if you knew that handling it in that way could have had really negative impact, what negative impact do you think that might have had? If you knew that handling something in this way could be of high risk to you, what do you think the risks might be? So you're still getting them to think through whatever the situation is, but you're not going down the criticism route. They're less likely to be defensive, and you're more likely to get them thinking about, okay, so if you knew that you could have approached this with a different style, what style might you have chosen to use? So they're really powerful. Now, for me personally, when I first heard those questions, I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to learn how to do this. And I'm probably not necessarily the fastest learner, but I could see the impact and the real potential power of developing that as a skill. I got myself a notebook. And what I did was, whenever I had a session of any sort, be it a one-on-one with a client, be it a team, be it delivering the 3-day program, whatever, I'd come out of the session afterwards and just give myself 5 or 10 minutes. And I'd ask myself the question, if I knew that I could have improved that session with great questions, what questions might I have chosen to ask? And then whatever question came into my head, I had them starting with if you knew that, I'd write them in my notebook. So I may come up with only 2, I may come up with 10, because I'd asked myself the same question several times. And I'd put them in my notebook. And then what I'd do is I'd read them out loud. So what I was doing was bringing all my senses into being. Kinesthetic, I'd created the question. Visual, I was reading it. Auditory, I was hearing it. Now, I really did that a tremendous amount. I ended up with a notebook, loads and loads of questions. But I can remember then, bit by bit, every so often, the right question would come in at the right time. And slowly my brain began to flip. Once it had flipped, I never lose it, never. I can trip those questions off the tip of my tongue. They are so worth becoming skilled at.
Yeah. One of the questions that, well, one of the questions I had when I learned about questioning. So I might be talking about something that's occurred to other people in the room. The first thing I thought when I went through the program and really started to hear about this questioning was, I just haven't got the time. I don't know whether that's resonating with anybody in the room, but I literally thought, oh shit, I've got people coming up to me 25 times a day asking for my input, asking if they're doing the right thing, asking for this. I haven't got time to then think about what questions I should be throwing back at them in order that they could come up with a solution. And so I think you or whoever I was working with on the training said something like, okay, so what do you do when all of these people come up to you with these questions? And I go, I tell them what to do. I give them the answer. Isn't that my job? And then I realised, because of course that wasn't my job. That was my job as a manager, maybe. It certainly wasn't my job as a leader. I was certainly not enabling them to think for themselves. I was literally telling them what to do and thinking that I'd done something really good because I'd helped them out. But of course, that's why I was having so many people, or even the same people, coming to me so many times. I've got to be honest, it still sometimes happens now, and it's about my behaviour, not theirs. That, when somebody comes to you when you're busy, if you ever like more than once, give them the answer, jump in with the solution, you're teaching them that it's okay to come to you whenever they need to, because you're going to have the solution for them and they don't need to think for themselves.
Yep.
And I really started, I thought, oh, well, that's what makes me such a good manager. So good, because I will just come up with all of the solutions. Well, really, what was going on in my head was I was thinking, well, I'm better than them. And even if I wasn't thinking that, that's exactly what I was giving them, you know, in terms of insight. I come up with the best ideas. It's just all about me. I'm going to have the best solutions. I'm going to have the most innovative ideas. I'm going to have, you know, the way out of this. I'm going to tell you how to problem solve this, not leadership, management. And as soon as I began to question more, it was awkward at first. You know, if any of you have got lots of people coming to you, no matter where you're sitting in the organization, you've got people coming to you for stuff. It could well be that your behaviors historically have kind of taught them to do that. And when you first start to do things a little bit differently, it can feel really odd, both to you and to them. My only advice in that would be to just stick with it. Even if you have to flag it or label it. Let's just look at this problem in a slightly different way. I'm going to ask you 2 or 3 questions about it. So you're labeling what you're doing. Because here's the thing, once they start coming up with their solutions, they don't come to you anymore because they don't need to, because they're doing it for themselves. And then all of a sudden, you've got way more time to think, which is probably more about what you're being paid to do. So I found that as quite an epiphany for me. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, though, Pen, is the listening, right? Just, you know, if you're questioning, you've also got to be able to listen. What can you share with us about the power of listening?
Oh, my God. It's so powerful. And, God, it can be so difficult. You know, it's really difficult to get out of your own head. So when you hear somebody coming up and you give them the opportunity to share their thoughts and ideas. In fact, let me just say 2 things. If you decide to go this route, and typically you've been in the style that Sherilyn and I were before we learned this, which is where we couldn't stop giving advice and everything else. If people suddenly find that they've got time to be listened to, Christ, it's as though they've got to do a verbal diarrhea dump. You know, somebody's listening to me, woohoo! And you think, God, I haven't got time for this. You know, how am I going to get everything done? Yeah, it will change. But in the beginning, you may get an awful lot. However, in the beginning, I've got to tell you, unless you walk on water and you learn things very quickly, it's not easy, because if you care about people and somebody's sharing with you a challenge they have, immediately what comes into your head, oh, well, I know what I do. I do this, 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 and this. And it's really hard, especially when it's somebody you care deeply about. It's really hard to go on saying, okay, that's interesting. And is there any more you think or feel about that? Okay, anything else that you think is important to allow yourself to think about? You know, to really listen. I know it's psychological, but I always need to sit on my hands, because it's not my hands that do the talking, but doing something to just listen. And it's listening in a way, the temptation can be, you're listening to somebody and they come up with a good idea and you start going, yeah, so you're not saying anything, but what you're doing is still doing your damnedest to direct them down that route because you think it's a good one. So really listening at somebody with fascination, care, respect, and support does take practice. And, you know, I have to tell you, there are times, and bear in mind, I've now been teaching this for 30 years. If you think that I'm now perfect, forget it. It doesn't happen. You know, I can still screw up. You know, again, one of the biggest ones I remember was Em's phoned up one day when she was having a real problem. They were buying another house and the mortgage advisor she'd got was absolute crap and kept delaying, and they thought they were going to lose the house. And Em's phoned me up having a real whinge about what was happening. Of course, I adore Ems. So I went straight to, right, Ems, what you need to do is dum, 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 dum. And I put the phone down. And then I put the phone down. I thought, what have I just done? I hadn't listened at all. I had the problem, went straight in. And I picked up the phone to her and I said, darling, I am so sorry. I said, let me listen to you again. Let me see if I can help you think this through for yourself. And she said, "Oh, that's Mum. Nice of you to apologise, Mum, but don't worry about it. I wasn't going to listen to you anyway." But
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah. And listening really takes some courage. And and this is why I say leadership's every part of your life. Let's say one of your children comes back from school. Ask yourself the question. You might say to them, "Did you have a good day, darling?" Or whatever. You might say it to your partner. Do you really sit and listen to them? Or do you really give them your attention? Or do you continue cooking the dinner, doing the clearing up, one eye on the television, one ear on them? What do you do? How valued do they feel? How incredible could it be if you actually turn to them and say, "Tell me about your day, darling. And what else went well for you today?" Mostly, really listening is a skill that we just don't have. We kid ourselves that life's too busy. And yet, when you think about it, the most important thing in our lives are our relationships. It doesn't matter if it's a relationship with our children, relationship with our partner, relationship with our colleagues, friends. How often do we really listen to them without other distraction? Just say, "You have my undivided attention at this time."
Yeah.
We probably don't do it enough.
We don't do it enough. Nobody does it enough. And in fact, I blame technology a lot because we're so used to communicating via every single medium except for just face-to-face, verbal language, that it's kind of short-circuiting our ability to really listen deeply. And, because we're all busy and there's so much going on, and, when somebody's talking to you, you tend to be going, yep, or interrupting because you just want to get to the point or whatever. And the art of listening is being lost. And I've always believed that listening is a leadership superpower. Well, it's a life superpower, but it's certainly a leadership superpower. And we do have a session with Oscar Trimboli, who wrote the book about listening. He's doing a session later in the curriculum on deep listening, and I think it's titled something like, "What does sex and listening have in common?" So it'll be interesting to find out. I'd like to find out myself. Anyway, I do feel that that's really important. We've got a question from Sarah. Do you have any advice on what questions to ask someone who's not a very good communicator? So a person can talk about work, but anytime a question on how he's feeling or what he wants, he clams up.
Okay, it depends on in which circumstances, and it depends, and I don't know if you're talking about somebody who's part of your team or a colleague or who it is. Let me assume at this moment it's somebody who's part of your team. The first thing I'd be saying to you is, with your team, have you begun to build trust with everybody by doing what we would call an introduction session? Now, you may say, "Oh, no, it's much too late. I've been working with this team for a long time. I can't do that anymore." The challenge is that often we don't do that in organizations. So we don't really know who people are. So you start asking them questions and they don't want to open up. It makes it not so easy. I believe, and I say to anybody who's going to join a new team and they're taking over from whoever it is and they're becoming a manager of a team, and even if it's somebody who's been promoted from within the team, I suggest that when you have your very first session together, what you do is what we would call an introduction session. So you may ask questions along the lines of, "Okay, tell us a little bit about who you are," and make it a bit jokey. So, not just about what you do and what company you've worked in, but how many children you've got. And maybe you can, you're married or you're not married. You travel to Barbados 3 times a year because you've got a lover out there, and you've got 23 dogs and you like Morris dancing and bell ringing. I don't know, but make it a bit jokey and say, share a bit about who you are. And then you might say, what are 3 things you feel really good about in your life? It could be achievements. It just be that you've got an amazing partner. It could be that you've got a job you love. It could be anything. It could then be, what's the biggest challenge or opportunity you're facing in your life right now? And then it might be, okay, if this could be the most amazing team ever, what are 3 things you might choose to get from working from this team? And what are 3 things that you want to give to help this be the most amazing team ever. So you might choose to do that, and be prepared to set aside a whole morning for it if need be. There is a golden rule. Absolutely, absolutely golden rule. You, as the most senior person, go first. Now, we do this at the beginning of every single program. And nearly always people will say that they're blown away, the people they've worked with for years, they realize they didn't know them. It has the most extraordinary impact. And people, what it does is create a foundation of trust. Now, when one of our trainers, or me running the program, the most senior person there, so when I was running top teams, the group CEO or the CEO knew that after I would like to go first, the CEO would always say, let me go first, so that they were setting the scene, being open and being vulnerable. So if you haven't done that, I would suggest doing it now, because if you want a high performing and amazing team, the first thing that you need to get is get trust. So not only do people trust you, but they believe that you trust them. And that is absolutely fundamental. And it's demonstrating that you're happy to be open about you. So I don't know how open you are with this individual who you say finds it difficult, how much you've shared about you. Because if you haven't, why should they share with you? But almost every team, every group, every CEO, every senior person who's ever been through this program, they will say this is fundamental to building trust and building a great team. So ask yourself whether you've been open and vulnerable with them, because why the hell should they be vulnerable with you if you're not? If you think, oh, I can't do an introduction session now, I've been with them too long, think about at the next meeting, do something a bit crazy. And it could be, look, it'd be really fun if we get to know each other a bit better. I'll tell you what, why don't, when we come to work and have our meeting on next Wednesday, let's all bring one thing that's very important to us that we can then talk about. And you may get some really odd things coming in. You might get somebody bringing in a gardening hat. You might get somebody bringing in a golf club, or, I don't know, a squash racket, or, I don't know, someone might bring in their dog, for God's sake. You know, you don't know, but something that's really important to them. And then they then talk about that importance. It's all about, how do I really get to know people so we build this amazing trust? The other thing that it helps you with is sometimes you will get a decision that has to be made in a team, and you get somebody who just won't go along with the decision. They don't like it. It could be something that's happened in their personal life that's caused them to have a really unhelpful belief around that sort of thing, and so they won't shift. How much easier if you've already got an awareness of that and understand it. So if you've got somebody who doesn't open up, of course you can go in with questions, but you need to be open with them first. And so you might even say to them, I know you don't find it easy talking about you, but let me share something about me with you first. So vulnerable first, and then say, so if you knew there's one thing that you could share that would give me a further insight into how we can work incredibly well together, what would you choose to share?
Yeah, really nice. Thank you, Pen. We've got a fabulous question from Catherine, and why I love this is because the answer is yes. So are there circumstances where it's appropriate to flex to manager, or should we behave as leaders all the time, questioning and listening all the time? And the answer is yes, it is appropriate. And I cannot tell you how excited I was when I realized that there were some times when being a manager is absolutely appropriate. So I did just let Penny tell you about that.
There's no question there are. And if you think about it, when first lockdown happened and COVID hit, there's no question that a lot more management behaviors came in, and they had to, because people had to make very scary decisions to basically keep the company afloat. You know, and there wasn't then the opportunity to have lots of discussions. It was a case of decisions had to be made. You have to go into management. So there are other times. So say you go in as a new manager into a team that's been underperforming for a long time, they're probably desperate to be given some advice to feel that they can pick up quickly. And you absolutely may need to go into management role. The scary bit is that sometimes you don't know when to step back into leadership. And so there may even be individuals in your team that you think, okay, there needs to be management behaviours with this person for a certain length of time. So absolutely, the key is when to back off. And the problem is, as I see it, and I'll be interested in what Sherilyn says here, once we start going down that management route, we forget to look to when's the time to back off. It becomes habitual.
It does. Oh, and when it becomes habitual, that's when the whole thing goes to shit. So here's what I learned, is that if management is about control, so if management is more about hierarchical or managerial behaviors, systems, processes, things that have to happen in a timely manner, have to happen with this budget, has to happen in this way, has to happen consistently, and the shit hits the fan. So there's something gone wrong in any context, where there's a bit of a fire or a bit of a drama or a bit of a crisis. No one wants to debate how that happened, why that happened, what we might think about doing, the 15 different routes we can go as a result of what this cock-up is. Nobody wants that, and neither do they need it, and it isn't helpful. At that time, that is the time when they need quite focused, fairly directive direction, input, advice. So just for the moment where there may be a burning platform, just for that moment, saying, I am going to shift into a very different style right now because we need to get ourselves out of this situation quickly. And the way in which we need to do that is this, this, and this. Once we've started to work our way out of this, then we'll get back together and maybe we'll talk about what we've learned about it. That is like totally appropriate, and you would be failing them if you didn't do that. But that is, for me, that's where management behaviors absolutely come to the fore. And there's always, there's always something going on where that's required. I literally thought it was a blessing because that's my default. I thought, I'm actually allowed to do it. But here's the thing. If you are predominantly leading, which you should, there's many, many more instances and time frames in which you can lead, with real time, investment of time, listening, questioning, enabling, empowering, and inspiring. That should be the majority of what you're doing. But when you have to shift into quite directive and quite controlling, if you don't label that, and that is not a natural style for you, that can freak them out. So making sure that they're aware why you may be shifting temporarily is quite important. And then absolutely understanding when you've got to take your foot off the pedal. And when that is when they start thinking about ways in which they can do this for themselves. So if you're still listening, whilst also being a bit directive, you will start to hear when they're ready for you to pull your foot off their neck and enable them to come up with, the ways of working for themselves. So I think it's that balance. The best leaders I know on the planet are the ones that can actually quite seamlessly shift across that quite consistently when the situation and the need arises, and then we'll very seamlessly shift back when it stops being an issue, when it's no longer an issue, and they get that balance. It's really nuanced, but it is a fantastic skill to be both a manager when you need to be and a leader the predominant time is really the suit. For me, for exceptional leadership, that's one of the goals. Have you got anything to build on that, Pen?
No, I think that's absolutely right. What you're saying is absolutely spot on. Nothing to add, really.
So Ian's got, this is the last question. We've only got a few minutes left. Ian's got a question. This is about feedback. Jesus, we realised this morning, Ian, that we could do an entire 2 hours just on feedback. But the question is, how do you deliver feedback on poor performance as a leader rather than a manager?
Okay. What you do is you, first of all, ask permission. So say to the person, let's sit down and have a conversation. Are you okay if we share some feedback together? The key is getting them to take responsibility, okay? And you can think of this for appraisals as well. So the first thing you might say is, if they're worried they're going to get some negative feedback, the quality of their capacity to think is not going to be good. They're expecting to get a bollocking or whatever, so it's not going to be useful. So I suggest what you do is say, okay, so I'd like to have a conversation. First of all, what I'd like to look at is things that you think currently have been going well for you in the job or in this project or whatever it is. So tell me what you think currently where you've been performing well, where the project's gone well and you've been handling it well. And they will hopefully share that. So if you knew that there's some areas where really it hasn't gone as well as it could have done and there's been errors, tell me what you think those are. And if you knew there are still some that I think may be missing, what do you think those are? So you will know where it is. And if they avoid something, you can ask them. But what you're endeavouring to do is get them to take responsibility rather than you feeding it to them. Then you know, if they don't come up with anything, I think I did everything well, then turn it around. If you knew that some areas that I definitely saw that I think didn't go well, what do you think those might be? You know, you push until they do find it. And then say, okay, so it's pretty important that this is turning. What can you, if you knew there's lots you can learn from this, what would that be? What do you need to put in place? So it's all about coming back to the question again. The key is getting them to take ownership. So if you tell them what's been going wrong, there may be occasions where you do have to. Don't hear me say you never do. But the key is getting them to take ownership. So in any feedback, you're doing your damnedest to get them to take ownership.
I've decided that we're definitely going to do a session just on feedback. It's like a skill that once you've got it, you can change people's lives with it. And one of the reasons why we don't give feedback is because we're so worried about what that person's going to think and feel about us. We withhold it. Yeah. Which is, you know, as a leader, the worst thing you can possibly do. So I'll work with you on that, Pen. We're going to deliver just a session of feedback. But we have come to the end of our time, I'm afraid. But please do hop over to the Virtual Campus Hub. Join the LinkedIn group so that we can communicate with you without spamming you. There are loads of really good live sessions. We've got Bobby Pickard from Trans in the City, talk about transforming your workplace. We've got all sorts on there. There's loads on demand. John Hegarty's session's doing really well on demand, which is about creativity. So please do hop over to the hub and get yourself on some more sessions. But thank you, darling, yet again. This woman's 80. Can you freaking believe that? Yeah, I can't believe it. She's like, I sometimes think that she's like my child. I feel like our situation is bitched. It's bizarre. She's way more energy than I do. But thank you, darling, for everything that you do for us. And we will see everybody else in a virtual campus very, very soon. Lots of love to everybody.
Bye, everybody.